It's so lovely to be here to do the Parsha Shir this week in Or Sameach in Cape Town, in this beautiful shul. And thank you all. It's so lovely to be with you, and thank you for this opportunity. Today I want to talk about how people exercise judgment all the time. In other words, we're constantly assessing people and situations, and on the basis of that analysis, we are making decisions and taking action. And the actions that we take eventually are based on the decisions. The decisions are based on the analysis. So we have to get that analysis right, and then everything falls into place. The big problem is this, and it's an inescapable problem, and that is human bias. Because as human beings, we cannot attain complete objectivity. It is impossible by definition of being a human being, and we'll explore that in a few moments. But the real danger about the concept of bias, where we're looking at something from a particular perspective, the real problem with the concept of bias is that we don't feel it or notice it. So like we have this impression of ourselves that we're objective, but actually we're not objective at all. We are deeply subjective. And because we're subjective, we can end up making the wrong analysis, then the wrong decisions, and then the wrong actions which are taken. And our Parsha deals with this in the context of the pursuit of justice and the court system, because that's obviously where the concept of bias can be most damaging. Now, what the Parsha says is, tzedek tzedek tirdof, you shall pursue justice, but it defines the concept of justice. It says shortly before that, v'shaftu esa'am mishpat tzedek, you shall judge the people with a judgment of righteousness. Lo tateh mishpat, do not make the judgment something which is perverted. In other words, tateh is really the concept of sending it in the wrong direction. And then it explains what that means. It says, lo sakir panim, do not recognize people. In other words, here is the concept of bias. The essence of bias in the Ibn Ezra then directs us to Devarim chapter 1, verse 17, where it says there, do not recognize, lo sakiru panim b'mishpat, don't recognize people, kekaton v'kagadol, whether they are great or they're small. And Rashi there explains, when you see the litigants before you, do not look at the one is poor, and therefore I have to show compassion. Or the one is rich, and therefore I have to show deference. Lo saguru mipnei, do not be afraid or do not be intimidated. The first order of business of the judge is to show no bias to the people in front of them. That's why the famous statue of Lady Justice is always blindfolded, so that you shouldn't be noticing. And that, of course, comes ultimately from the Torah, this idea that you have to be open and look at the litigants as they are with no prejudgments. In fact, prejudice comes from the word to prejudge, because we are naturally inclined towards bias, and so the Torah is warning us against that. But then our Parsha goes on to another thing, because there's the bias of prejudice by prejudging people, by saying this person deserves compassion, this person deserves deference, I'm more inclined to this person, I like the look of this person. There's natural human bias in all of those things. The other dimension is the bias of vested interest. So the Parsha says, v'lo sikach shochad, do not take a bribe, ki ha-shochad ya'aver einei chachamim v'yisalef divrei tzadikim, because the bribe will blind the eyes of the wise, which actually is a counter to the Lady Justice, because real justice cannot be blindfolded. It has to be unbiased, but the judge has to see what's going on. It requires careful analysis, and it says the problem with bribes is that it prevents you from seeing it with absolute clarity. And Rashi there says, based on the Gemara, that means even if you take the bribe, even with the intention of paskening, of ruling in accordance with the truth, the human being is no longer able to do it, because we become biased. And so that's what our Parsha frames. As you know, this series is about looking at the Parsha through the eyes of Pirkei Avot. And this is a theme which appears in Pirkei Avot in a number of places. In chapter 1, Mishnah 8, it is in essence about the pursuit of justice from the point of view of the judges. And it says and clarifies for us the idea of objectivity. It says to the judges, Al tas atzmacha k'orchei dayanim, do not make yourself like the advocates, meaning you mustn't take sides. And ukashiyu abale dinim omdim lefanecha, when they appear before you, you should look at them kirashayim. You should not prejudge and say this one is right and this one is wrong. You look at them equally. You give them both the fairness of the assessment of the judgment. And the Avos de Rabbi Nassan on that Mishnah Pirkei Avos actually brings what we saw previously in Rashi, that same idea. He says when they're standing before you, don't look at the wealth or the social status of the one or the other. Don't feel compassion towards the one, no matter what their life circumstances. The job of the judge is to decide the case based on the merits and on the merits alone. But there is another dimension to bias, because it's not only about the prejudging of people and the vested interest. There's another dimension to that, and that is overconfidence, because we tend towards a particular opinion. And so that's why it says in chapter 1, Mishnah 9, it says, make sure to interrogate and cross-examine the witnesses. Go extensively in that. Be careful, because you may be making a mistake. But the classic one is actually the opening lines of Pirkei Avos. After it gives the introduction of the Masorah, of the tradition handed down from Har Sinai, it gives the opening words of Pirkei Avos, Hevu Masunim Bedin, be patient and cautious in judgment. Because what it's really saying is this: human beings tend to make mistakes. We have to acknowledge that. And the judge has to then proceed with great caution, because overconfidence and jumping to conclusions, this is where bias comes in. You hear a case, or you're assessing a situation, there's an automatic, natural feeling, this is the right or this is the wrong, and that natural feeling, that gut instinct, could be dead wrong. It may be right, but it may be completely wrong, and therefore it says, be careful. Like the Rav Vladimir Bar Tanur in the commentary in the Mishnah there says, you may have seen a case like this many times over that looks very similar, but still be very careful. Don't prejudge the case. Make sure to give it the fair time and the fair opportunity. And Rabbeinu Yonah says you should second guess yourself. Your first instinct may be right or it may be wrong, but the human being is prone to bias and is unaware of their own biases. The way the Meiri puts it is very beautiful. He says, Dimyono mechasev lo. Your imagination, because the human being has the capacity to imagine and come up with all kinds of theories and ideas when you're looking at a situation, and he says that can impede it. So what do you do? So what Pirkei Avot is saying, firstly, be aware, proceed with caution. It's also saying procedural justice is critical, because it says kushiyu omdim lefanecha, when they are standing before you. Omdim means the Rashbat says that they must be treated equally. And the Rambam writes this in Hilchos Sanhedrin based on the Gemaras and, in fact, on the Psukim, which Rashi refers to the beginning of our Parsha, that talks about procedural justice. Earlier on in chapter 1 of Devarim, Rashi is there talking about substantive justice. Substantive justice is you don't favor the poor over the rich or the rich over the poor. Procedural justice is people must be treated with fairness in the court. The processes and the procedures have to be fair and transparent and equitable, because procedural justice, how people are treated in court, and the Rambam says that you mustn't, the judge cannot be overly harsh with one litigant versus the other. He must give both a chance to talk. A fundamental principle of Torah justice is you cannot hear one claimant without the defendant present. Both parties must be present at all that time. The procedural justice is not administrative technicalities. It is justice itself. And in fact, that's what the Gemara says. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Why does it say justice, justice thou shalt pursue? The double reference to justice is because it must not only be justice in substance, but it must be justice in the procedures. And so we start to get a bit of a framework of the concept of the decision making. What the Tiferet Yisrael does with that opening Mishnah, Hevu Masunim Bedin, be cautious in judgment, he then expands it to all life decisions. He says this is not only talking to a judge in a court who's paskening, he makes it relevant to each one of us, and that's what Pirkei Avot is there. It's talking directly to each one of us, and says the Tiferet Yisrael, what that means is when we are making life decisions, and that can mean Milestone decisions are all can be very simple things: assessing a particular person, assessing a situation, making a judgment call on it, then making a decision, then making an action. Heve masunim, be careful, because in the same way that a judge can be biased against one or of the claimants jumping to conclusions, so too we are in the position of being judges every single day of our life. We are judging the people around us, we're judging our life situations, we are making decisions which are directly impacting on our well-being and happiness and of those around us. And if our judgment is flawed, we're going to make the wrong decisions, we're going to do the wrong things, and in so doing can bring misery upon ourselves and others. And so therefore it's saying, Hevu masunim bedin, be careful. So when we look at what Pirkei Avot and our Parsha is teaching us about decision making, it's saying, be aware of the dangers of human bias. Therefore exercise great caution. Not only should you be aware and exercise great caution, but follow the right procedures, even when making decisions. Be meticulous in the decision-making process so you can follow procedural justice when you're making your own decisions. But the truth is this: the concept of bias is much more profound than anything we have spoken about. Because the human being is fundamentally biased in the deepest possible way. And I want to explain what that is by reference to something else in our Parsha. Our Parsha deals with the concept of prophecy. And it says there will be prophets who will emerge amongst the Jewish people. And we know, we have the whole book of prophets, the Nevi'im. It warns against those who are sorcerers and try to predict the future based on using methods which the Torah looks down upon and cautions us against. And yet it said they are real prophets. What is prophecy? So the kind of conventional wisdom, simplistic approach to prophecy is saying, well, it's fortune telling, looking and peering into the future. But the Rambam gives us a definition of prophecy which has got nothing to do with the ability to predict the future, that God's going to whisper into your ear what the future holds and what it doesn't hold. The Rambam refers to a statement that our sages make, the way that they encapsulate the highest level of prophecy that Moses attained, which is called the aspaklaria me'ira, which is the clear lens. It's the clear lens, because when we look at life, when you have glasses and you're looking at the world, if your glasses are smudged, then the world that you look at, the reality that you perceive is going to be smudged. You're not going to see it with absolute clarity. If your prescription is off, it's going to look blurred. You're not going to be able to understand it. The highest level of prophecy is when the lenses you are wearing are so clear that you see perfect, pure truth, and you have total clarity on the world. Now, a human being cannot get to the total clarity because the barrier that we have, which is insurmountable, is the body. The physical body, when the soul exists in the world of the souls with Hashem, the soul sees everything with total clarity. There's no clouding of its judgment. It sees pure truth. It understands everything. When the soul gets put into the body, the ability of the soul to see the world becomes murky. It can't see anymore because it's now trapped in a body and trapped in a physical world, and therefore you cannot attain clarity. And the Rambam says the path to prophecy is the path to clarity. And he explains that, and he explains this in chapter 7 of the Shmona Prakim, his classic introduction to Pirkei Avot, setting the scene for what Pirkei Avot is. And he says that total clarity is when you have clarity of the intellect and clarity that comes from the perfection of character. Both of those two dimensions, because you need to be able to understand the world from an intellectual point of view, but the barriers to understanding the world are not just intellectual, they are character. A person who is filled with anger and jealousy, a person who is filled with arrogance cannot see the world. He's unable to perceive. There's a barrier to actually understanding the people around them. And he quotes the Gemara that says that a Navi, a prophet, must be Chacham, Ashir, V'Gibor. A person who is wise, wealthy, and strong. And he defines wealth as based on Pirkei Avot. Who is wealthy? A person who is happy with their lot. Who is strong? A person who conquers their inclination. And so therefore he says that is the picture of the perfect person. Who is wise, who has contentment and a sense of abundance in life, and a person who has self-discipline and self-mastery. That is the holistic greatness of a person. When a person attains those levels, they become a prophet, meaning they become the highest thing, the highest version that a human being can become, not to be a fortune teller, but to be a person of such elevated refinement that they attain greatness. Moses got to the highest level, to the point where he was asking God the mysteries of the universe, and God said to him, Lo yirani hadam v'chai, no man can see me and live, because Moses reached the highest level that a human being could live. He was reach, and he was a prophet, but he could not escape the body. Even that God said, you're still immortal, you cannot get beyond that. And he was trying to delve into the deepest secrets of the universe, which includes understanding the suffering of the righteous and the prospering of the wicked. And God said there's a certain level of clarity you cannot attain while you are still in a body. And what that means is there are barriers to clarity. I want to give an example directly from our Parsha, from an amazing idea from Reb Elchanan Wasserman, because the Parsha says, Lo ysikach shocha, don't take a bribe. Reb Elchanan Wasserman analyzes this problem. He says, on the one hand, we are commanded to believe in God. And when we are given a mitzvah, it means it is attainable. And it means it's attainable for a child who's turning an adult, a boy of 13, a girl of 12. So we are commanded to believe in God, and yet he said there are great philosophers and scientists who do not believe in God with their awesome intellect. So how can the Torah command it? So he says atheism is rooted in a bribe, because a bribe, we know how it affects judgment. When the judge takes a bribe, and do you know how fine the laws of bribery are in Torah law? If a litigant starts to greet a judge, or even just greets a judge and they didn't used to greet, that is already regarded as giving them a bribe of a greeting of warmth that they didn't have before. That itself could cloud the judgment of the judge. So says Reb Elchanan Wasserman, there is an allure to atheism, because then there's no God, there's no accountability. Everything in the world that you want, you can do. There's no sense of having to strive for greatness. There's no higher morality. And so the world came into Darwinism and atheism, because there was an agenda to remove Hashem from the world and to make the world free of God. And that, he says, means the ability to see things. Now, if we want to understand what this is, we only need to look at what's happening in the politics today and say, look at the world's bias against Israel in the media. What happens? Israel is fighting a war for its survival against a savage terror entity. And while it's fighting them, it's feeding them, it's trying to look after and trying to return its hostages, fighting forces all around it, which are existential forces, and it's the only democracy in the region, and the whole world is jumping on Israel, and they'll line up all their so-called facts, because there's a bias. There's the bias of prejudgment or prejudice or anti-Semitism. Means they're not coming clean to look at the facts. They're coming in with a bias that says beforehand. And so what you start to see happen here is that human beings, because of the layered levels of bias, come in with an agenda that's beforehand. Do you know how far this goes? The idea of bias is in groupthink. There's a famous Solomon Asch experiment that was done when a person was asked to look at 3 lines, and the one line was clearly shorter than the other, and yet there were people planted in the experiment who looked at the lines and said that the shorter line is longer. And when the subject of the experiment had to come in, he then conceded to their judgment, saying it's shorter, but it was clearly longer. Most actually succumbed to the peer pressure. Such is the weakness of human judgment and the propensity for bias, that the social influence caused them to see something which was dramatically obvious, the longer line, seeing it as shorter because of the social pressure behind us. Human beings are so weak in that way, and so we have to be aware of it. And so what the process then of attaining prophecy is about clearing the human being from a sense of bias through elevation of character, understanding of intellect, and that's in essence what the whole Torah is about. It gives us if you think about the second Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, that the world stands on three things: Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim, the learning of Torah, the doing of mitzvahs, and acts of kindness, which the Rambam says it is the mastery of the intellect through learning Torah, it is the mastery of the body through doing mitzvahs, and it is the mastery of human character, which is represented by kindness. Meaning the Torah is a formula, a holistic formula that gives us the truth of our studies, gives us a character building program, and gives us mitzvahs to do so that we can attain this idea of prophecy, not fortune telling, but a level of the greatness of the human being, which the Mishnah in Avos in chapter 2, Mishnah 13 describes, Roe es hanoilad, meaning somebody who reaches this level can peer into the future, not because they have prophecy, but because when you start to understand the world with such clarity and you approach it with the clarity of an intellect that knows Hashem and is refined and is a humble person of compassion and decency and empathy and contentment and abundance. There's no jealousy, there's no desire, there's no pursuit of honor and arrogance. All of those agendas are removed. Then a clarity comes to a person that allows a human being to see all the things of life, to understand with clarity the relationships around them, the family, business, all of the big decisions of life that have to be made can now all of a sudden be made through the prism of Hashem's values, with the greatness of spirit that comes with it, and that leads to the highest levels of human functioning, the optimum level of human functioning, and that in essence, according to the Rambam, is what Pirkei Avot is about. Because the Gemara says Pirkei Avot is the book that gives us the guidance to Chasidus, to saintliness. And the Rambam says that saintliness, quoting from the Talmud, the saintliness brings to prophecy, because that brings you the clarity. And that's why the Rambam says, he says, you know what, Pirkei Avot and the study of Pirkei Avot and the immersion in all of our Torah values, you know what that brings? He says it brings shleimus gedola. This is what he says in the introduction to Pirkei Avos. It brings the completeness of the person, the perfection, the all-roundedness of the person, because it's intellect, it's character, it's actions, it's everything. And then he says an amazing thing, v'osher amiti, true happiness. Because you see, the barriers that block, whether it is the ability to see the world for what it is, whether it is the ability to see the Creator who loves us and who has created this world and has given our lives meaning and purpose, whether it is the ability to see and understand what it is to be a Jew and what the world and the dynamics in the world, and understanding the clarity of our purpose in life, that brings with it such a clarity that comes with happiness. And not only that, when a person then achieves the personal levels of development and refinement of character, where we fill our lives and we fill ourselves and we become the embodiment of contentment, of humility, of empathy, of compassion, of understanding, then when all of that comes together in one person, then firstly, the decisions that we make become the right decisions. We don't make decisions because of jealousy, don't make decisions because of anger, because of the desire for revenge, because of resentment, because of anxiety, because of fear. All of the things that lead to bad decision making are primarily faults in character. When decisions come from fear and anxiety and from anger and from resentment and from arrogance and from pursuit of honor, then we make the wrong decisions. When we don't have a clear prism and understanding what our values and truths are in the world, we make the wrong decisions. When we make the right decisions, then we bring happiness and contentment and goodness into our lives. Then we can see life for what it is, and then we're at peace with ourselves. And so that perfection leads to a holistic sense of balance, of happiness, and a true sense of connection with ourselves and Hashem, because the aspaklaria mira, that clear lens, is the lens, the barrier between us and Hashem, to see with absolute clarity everything. And so when we started our discussion about the idea of bias and how it affects the judicial process of justice and how it affects our decision-making every day, actually what bias represents is the barriers of the body. And greatness, what Pirkei Avot calls us to, is the idea of the refinement, the upliftment to become the greatest person that we can. Then we shed the bias as much as a human being, to the point of where Moses got to that level. And it's not the work of a goal that can be achieved in a week or a month. This is the work of our lifetime. The purpose of life, according to the way the Rambam defines it in his introduction to Avot, and that's what all of Pirkei Avot is about, is a person who can reach these great levels. This is really the work and the journey of a lifetime. The closer we get to that, the closer we become to holistic greatness, and the closer we become to true happiness.